I never thought I'd find myself standing behind a camera at the biggest day of his life, knowing full well that the guy smiling down the aisle wasn't really just someone's husband-to-be. He was the guy I'd loved for longer than I cared to admit. Yeah, I was the wedding photographer. And yeah, he pulled me aside during the reception like the whole world suddenly shrank to just the two of us. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind a bit. I've been a photographer for about 5 years now, mostly doing weddings because, well, the paychecks are good and I love capturing real moments. There's something about the way genuine emotion looks through a lens that never gets old. But this wedding, it was different from the start, mostly because I'd known the groom, Mark, way before he ever met his fiancée. Mark and I met back in college, in a literature class no less. He was that guy who could make a class on 18th century poetry feel like a stand-up routine. And honestly, I was smitten from the first lecture. We hung out a bit, studied together, grabbed coffee, but I never worked up the nerve to say anything because, well, he was straight. Or at least that's what I thought. I'd been too scared to find out otherwise. Fast forward 7 years. We lost touch for a while after college, but reconnected on social media, which led to an unexpected friendship that felt like no time had passed at all. He told me about his new life, his job, his fiancée, Sarah. I congratulated him, genuinely. I wanted to be happy for him. But my stomach twisted every time he mentioned her, every time he sent me pictures of their adventures or their engagement shoot. So when he called me out of the blue and asked if I'd photograph their wedding, I hesitated. A lot. Part of me wanted to say no. How was I supposed to capture their love when I was drowning in my own feelings? But then I figured maybe it was a chance to finally be there for him in some way, even if it hurt. The wedding was set in this rustic, sun-dappled vineyard just outside the city. You know the kind, vine-covered trellises, fairy lights strung everywhere, that perfect golden hour glow that photographers dream about. The whole vibe was warm and intimate, exactly the kind of scene I usually thrive in. Except this time, the heaviness in my chest kept me from getting lost in it. When Mark showed up, looking sharp in a tailored navy suit, I swear my heart stopped. He looked so confident, so happy, I almost convinced myself he was exactly where he wanted to be. But then those little moments, how his eyes searched the crowd nervously, how he kept glancing around like he was waiting for someone, started to feel different. Like something was off. I tried to focus on my work, snapping candids of laughing guests, close-ups of their intertwined hands, the way Sarah's eyes sparkled when she looked at Mark. But I couldn't shake this growing tension, this knot in my stomach that told me I was about to witness more than just a wedding. And then, during the reception, right after the speeches, and just before the first dance, Mark sidled up to me. His face was flushed, but not from the heat or the wine. There was this desperate urgency in his eyes as he tugged me away from the crowd, pulling me into the shadows behind the barn. It was then he said the words that shattered everything I thought I knew about that day, about him and about us. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, because what he said next, well, it changed everything. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit me like a punch in the gut. "We need to talk," he said, eyes darting around like he was afraid someone might overhear. I nodded, heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it too. We found a quiet spot behind the barn, the hum of the party muffled by the wooden walls and the rows of grapevines stretching out beyond us. The sunlight had faded, replaced by that soft twilight glow that made everything feel kind of unreal. For a moment, all I could do was look at him, Mark, the guy I'd wanted for years, standing right in front of me, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. "Okay," I said, swallowing down the lump in my throat. "What's going on?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking every bit as conflicted as I felt. "I don't know how to say this without making things worse," he started. "But I've been lying to everyone, including Sarah." I blinked, trying to process that. "Lying? About what?" Mark took a shaky breath. "About who I am. I'm not the guy that first told you I was. I'm not straight." I didn't say anything. I think I was too stunned for words. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. "I've known for a long time, but I buried it because I thought it was easier. Because I thought this." He gestured vaguely toward the house, the party, the whole wedding. This was what I was supposed to want. I felt my chest tighten. "So, you're saying you don't love Sarah?" "It's complicated," he admitted. "I care about her. She's amazing, but it's not the same. And I can't keep pretending anymore. Not here. Not today." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a confession. It was a silent plea for help, for understanding, for something I wasn't sure I could give. We stood there in silence for a while, the noise of laughter and music leaking through the cracks in the barn walls. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, searching for a reaction. Finally, I took a breath. "Why me? Why tell me?" His eyes glistened with something raw. Fear, hope, maybe both. "Because you've always been the one I could be honest with. Because you were there when I was trying to figure myself out. And because I don't have anyone else to turn to right now." It was a lot to take in, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to say next. I'd rehearsed a million responses in my head over the years, but none of them felt right in the moment. "I'm not sure what this means," I said finally. "For you, for Sarah, for—" He nodded. "I don't have answers either, but I couldn't go through with this lie anymore. Not today." We stood there a little longer, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt both heavy and freeing. I could hear the faint strains of the first dance starting inside, and I knew the rest of the night was still waiting, full of smiles and toasts and promises. But for a moment, none of that mattered. It was just the two of us, caught in this unexpected, fragile moment of truth. Then he reached out and squeezed my shoulder. "I'm sorry to drag you into this." I surprised myself by smiling. "You don't have to apologize. I'm glad you told me." He looked at me like I'd just given him permission to breathe again. "Let's get through tonight," I said, "and then we figure out the rest." He nodded, relief flooding his face. "Yeah, together." We headed back inside, the buzz of the party wrapping around us like a warm blanket. I picked up my camera again, but this time, everything felt different. Like I wasn't just the photographer anymore. I was somewhere in the middle of a story that was still unfolding, and I had no idea how it was going to end. Back inside, the reception was in full swing. The string lights cast a soft glow over the crowd, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. Mark slipped back into the role of the groom, putting on a brave face for Sarah and their guests. I could see the tightness in his smile when no one was looking, that subtle tension in his jaw. It was like he was walking a thin line, trying not to fall but not sure how long he could keep it up. I kept my distance mostly, camera in hand, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. There was an ache in my chest I tried to ignore, a mix of longing and the fear that this was already slipping through my fingers. Later, as the night wore on, I found myself alone near the edge of the vineyard, the scent of grapevines and earth thick in the cool night air. I was reviewing some shots on the camera when Mark found me. "Hey," he said softly, stepping into the moonlight. "Hey," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, then spoke. "How are you holding up?" I laughed nervously. "Honestly, I'm not sure, but I'm glad you told me earlier. It's a lot to process." He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. I don't want to hurt anyone, especially Sarah. But I also can't keep living a lie." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "Have you talked to her about this?" "No," he admitted. "Not yet. I'm scared of what it might do to her, and to me." I swallowed hard. "You know, you don't have to figure this all out tonight, or even tomorrow. But I want you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need." His eyes softened, and for a moment, the years of silence between us felt like they were slipping away. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a while longer, the quiet night wrapping around us. Then, out of nowhere, he smiled, the kind of genuine smile that lights up a face, and said, "Remember that poetry class where you joked about love being the ultimate mystery?" I chuckled. "Yeah, how could I forget?" "Well," he said, "feels like I'm living proof that love isn't simple or neat. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it's terrifying, but maybe it's worth the risk." I looked at him, and something shifted inside me. Hope, maybe. Or the possibility that this complicated, messy thing might just be real. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept photographing, capturing the moments as best as I could. but my mind was elsewhere. Every smile Mark gave Sarah felt like a bittersweet echo, every dance a reminder of everything unspoken. When the party started winding down, and most guests had gone, Mark found me again. "Can we talk? Alone?" I nodded, heart thudding. We slipped out to the vineyard, the moon high and bright. He took a deep breath. "I don't know what happens next, but I do know I can't keep pretending. I'm gonna tell Sarah, and whatever comes after, I need to face it honestly." I reached out, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Whatever you decide, you're not alone." He nodded, eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you for being here, for listening, for everything." That night, as I packed up my gear, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Things were unfolding in ways I never expected, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the messy, complicated truth was exactly where we were supposed to be. As I drove home under the stars, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful moments aren't the ones you plan to capture. They're the ones that catch you off guard and change everything. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new between us. But that was just the beginning. The real story was still waiting to be written. The next few days felt like walking on a tightrope. I kept checking my phone more than I'd like to admit, waiting for Mark to reach out. I wanted to be there for him, but I also didn't want to push. It was his story to tell, after all. Then one evening, just as the sun was dipping below the skyline, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark, simple and to the point. "Can we meet?" I replied almost instantly. "Yeah. When?" "Now. I'm at the coffee shop we used to go to back in college. It's quiet." Within 20 minutes, I was there, pushing open the door to that familiar little place, the smell of roasted beans and old books wrapping around me. He was sitting at our old corner table, the one with the cracked window and the faded graffiti on the ledge. He looked different somehow, more worn, maybe, or just tired. But when he saw me, a flicker of that old warmth came back. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Hey," I answered. We sat across from each other, the place filled with the quiet murmur of other patrons and the soft clatter of cups. "So," he started. I told Sarah. I waited, holding my breath. It was harder than I thought. She was shocked, hurt, confused. Understandably, we talked for hours. She deserves the truth, even if it breaks everything. I nodded. "That sounds rough." "Yeah, but also freeing. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm being honest with myself. And with her. We don't know what the future looks like, but at least it's real now." I reached out, covering his hand with mine. "That's brave, Mark. I'm proud of you." He smiled, a little sadly, but it felt genuine. "Thanks. I'm scared about what comes next, but I don't want to live a lie anymore, and I don't want to lose the people I care about." We talked for hours about everything and nothing, about old memories, the weight of expectations, the fear of change. For the first time, the walls between us felt like they were crumbling. "I miss this," he said quietly. "Talking to you, being myself." "Me too," I admitted, but then there was that pause, like both of us knew this wasn't just about friendship anymore. "Do you think there's still a chance for us?" he asked, almost afraid to say it. I looked him in the eye, feeling my heart hammering. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I want to find out." That night, as I left the coffee shop, something shifted. It wasn't a neat, tidy resolution, and I wasn't sure what the future held. Not for Mark, not for Sarah, and definitely not for me. But for the first time, there was a flicker of hope that maybe the complicated, messy feelings I'd kept bottled up could finally breathe. In the days that followed, I stayed close but gave him space. We texted more, sometimes sharing little moments. A song that reminded us of college, a ridiculous meme, a photo of a sunset. It was slow, tentative, but it was real. Then one afternoon, Mark called me out of the blue. "Can you come over? I need to show you something." When I arrived at his apartment, he was waiting by the window, looking out at the city skyline. He turned as I walked in, a nervous smile tugging at his lips. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about who I am, who I want to be, and what I want from life." I nodded, heart racing, and I realized that I don't want to hide anymore, not from myself, and not from you. He stepped closer, the air between us electric. "I want to try, to see if we can build something real." I swallowed hard, feeling every emotion rush through me at once. Hope, fear, excitement. "I want that too," I said, my voice barely a whisper. That night, we talked for hours, about hopes and fears, about the past and the uncertain future. It wasn't perfect. There were still questions, doubts, and the reality of messy lives waiting outside that apartment door. But for the first time, I felt like we were starting something honest. Something worth fighting for. Looking back now, I realized that sometimes the hardest moments, the confessions, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, are the ones that lead us to the greatest truths. And maybe, just maybe, love isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to ask the questions together. Over the next few weeks, everything felt like it was unfolding in slow motion and fast forward all at once. Mark and I were navigating this new, fragile territory, trying to be honest with ourselves and each other, while also figuring out what that meant for the mess of lives tangled around us. He was still working through the fallout from telling Sarah. They hadn't made any immediate decisions about the relationship, but the tension was obvious whenever he talked about her. I could see it behind his eyes, the guilt, the uncertainty, the weight of knowing he'd hurt someone he cared about. One evening, I found myself sitting on his couch, camera forgotten beside me, as he paced back and forth in his small living room. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice raw. "How do you step into a life that feels like it's already built without you? How do you not feel like the villain?" I reached over and took his hand. "You're not a villain. You're just human, and sometimes being honest is the hardest thing we can do." He gave me a weary smile. "I want to believe that. I really do." There was a pause, the kind that fills the room with something unspoken but deeply felt. "I'm scared, you know," he finally said. "Scared that I've lost too much already, that I'm going to lose you too." I squeezed his hand tighter. "Mark, none of this is easy, but if there's one thing I know, it's that I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to." He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see the walls starting to crumble. It was the first time I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could build something that wasn't just a fleeting moment stolen from broken beginnings. Our connection deepened in these quiet moments, texting late into the night, meeting up for coffee, sharing songs and stupid jokes, and sometimes just sitting side by side without saying a word. There was an unspoken understanding between us that this was complicated, that we were both stepping into messy territory. One weekend, Mark invited me to meet a few of his close friends. He'd been hesitant, worried about what they might think or say, but I could tell it was important to him. We showed up at a small gathering in a friend's backyard, fairy lights twinkling overhead, the smell of grilled food in the air. His friends greeted me warmly, and it felt like the first step toward bringing the different parts of his life into alignment. As the night wore on, Mark and I slipped away from the group, wandering toward the edge of the yard where the city lights stretched out before us. "I'm tired of hiding," he said quietly, resting his head on my shoulder. "Tired of pretending I'm someone I'm not." I wrapped an arm around him. "You don't have to anymore. Not with me." We stood there for a while, the noise of the party fading into the background. In that moment, it felt like the world had shrunk down to just us and the future we might build, even if that future was still uncertain. But reality has a way of crashing in. A week later, Mark called me, his voice tight with emotion. "Sarah wants to meet. She wants to talk about everything." I could hear the fear in his words. "Are you okay?" He sighed. "I don't know, but I have to face it. I owe her that much." The meeting was tense, more raw and painful than either of us expected. Sarah was hurt, angry, confused. She asked questions Mark couldn't answer, and I tried to be there for him without overstepping. It was a turning point, not just for Mark and Sarah, but for all of us. Because from that conversation, a new kind of honesty started to emerge. No more pretending, no more hiding, just the messy, complicated truth. Afterward, Mark and I sat in his apartment, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy. "I don't want to hurt her," he said, voice breaking, "but I can't keep living a lie either." I pulled him into a hug, feeling the tremble in his body. "You're doing the right thing. It's just hard." He nodded, burying his face in my shoulder. "I'm scared of what comes next. But with you, I feel like I can face it." And that was the thing. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future held, or how the pieces of our lives would fit back together. But for the first time in a long time, we had something real, something worth fighting for. And sometimes, that's all you need. In the days that followed the conversation with Sarah, the atmosphere around Mark shifted. It wasn't like some sudden breakthrough or dramatic breakup, more like the quiet unraveling of a tightly wound coil. He was distant sometimes, weighed down by guilt and the uncertainty of what his next step should be. But when we were alone, there was this fragile tenderness between us, like we were both tiptoeing carefully towards something neither of us fully understood yet. One afternoon, he texted me, "Want to get out of the city? Just for a bit." I didn't hesitate. "Meet me at the train station in an hour," I replied. We took the train to this small town, about an hour away, somewhere quiet, with rolling hills and a river that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Mark had always loved nature, and I think he needed a break from the noise of his life, the expectations, the judgments, the tangled mess of emotions. We wandered along the riverbank, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about the moments of doubt, the nights he spent staring at the ceiling, wrestling with who he was and what he wanted. I shared pieces of my own story, my fears, my hopes, the years I'd spent hiding feelings that now felt impossible to ignore. At one point, Mark stopped, looking out at the water. "I don't know if I'm ready to come out to everyone. Not yet. But I want to be out to you. Fully." I smiled, feeling a rush of warmth. "You already are, and I'm proud of you." He looked at me then, really looked, with this vulnerability that made my chest ache. "I'm scared, though. Scared of losing everything. But I'm more scared of losing myself." That honesty knocked the breath out of me. It was raw and real. The kind of moment you don't forget. We sat by the river for a while, just being there with each other. It wasn't perfect. There were still questions hovering in the air, but it was ours. When we got back to the city, things started to shift in small but meaningful ways. Mark began being more open about who he was with close friends. It was slow, sometimes awkward, but it was progress. And every time he took a step forward, I felt like I was walking alongside him, holding his hand through the unknown. One night, sitting in his apartment with the city lights twinkling outside, Mark turned to me and said, "I want to introduce you to my mom. She's always been supportive, but she doesn't know about us." I nodded. I'd like that. Meeting his mom was nerve-wracking, of course. There's always that tension when you're stepping into someone's personal world, trying to find your place. But she was warm and welcoming, asking me questions about photography and making jokes about how Mark had always been a bit of a hopeless romantic. Mark and I left her place that night feeling lighter, like another wall had come down. But not everything was smooth sailing. Sarah's presence still loomed in the background. Mark and I had some tough conversations about boundaries, about timing, about how to respect her feelings, while also carving out space for our own. One evening, after a particularly hard day, we sat on the floor of his living room, exhausted and emotionally raw. "I hate hurting her," he said, voice trembling. "But I can't keep living in this in-between space." I brushed a hand through his hair. "You're doing your best. And sometimes, that's all anyone can ask." He leaned into me, and for the first time, it felt like we were building something real. Not just a secret, not just an escape, but a foundation. Weeks turned into months. Mark and Sarah amicably separated, respecting each other's need for honesty and healing. Mark and I continued to navigate our new relationship with all its ups and downs. There were nights filled with laughter and quiet tenderness, days when the world felt heavy and overwhelming. But through it all, there was a thread of something that kept us going: hope. One afternoon, as we were walking through a park near his apartment, Mark stopped and looked at me. "I want to thank you," he said softly, "for being patient, for believing in me, for seeing me." I smiled. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad we found our way back." He took my hand then, squeezing it gently. I don't want to hide anymore. Not from you. Not from anyone. I felt my heart swell. Neither do I. And as we walked on, side by side, I realized that sometimes the most complicated stories, the ones filled with uncertainty and fear, are the ones that lead us to the truest kind of love. The kind that's messy, imperfect, but wholly ours. By the time we reached the small cafe where we decided to grab coffee, the late afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows over the streets. Mark and I settled into a corner booth, the familiar hum of quiet conversations and the clink of cups around us folding gently into the background. We'd come a long way since that night behind the barn, the secret confession, the uncertainty, the hesitant steps forward. Now, sitting across from each other with warm drinks in our hands, there was an ease between us that felt hard-won but real. "I've been thinking," Mark began, tracing the rim of his mug, "about how much has changed. How messy and complicated it's been, but also how it's brought me closer to who I actually am." I nodded, smiling softly. "It's not just you. I've had to come to terms with a lot too. My feelings, my hopes, everything I thought I wanted." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. "Thank you for being patient with me, for sticking around when things were confusing." "I never left." I squeezed his hand gently. "I wanted to be here for you, for us." There was a pause, comfortable and full of meaning. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, as dusk settled in. Mark's eyes met mine, steady and sincere. "I don't have a neat story or a clear plan, but I know I want to keep building something with you. Something honest." I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet certainty that this was the start of something important. "Me too. No matter what comes next." We stayed there for a while longer, just holding hands across the table, letting the world drift by. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people who had found each other in the middle of life's chaos and decided to take the leap together. Later that evening, as we walked home beneath the stars, Mark slipped his hand into mine. It felt like the simplest gesture, but it carried everything: trust, acceptance, hope. Loving someone isn't always easy or clean. It's messy, it's uncertain, and sometimes it's downright scary. But standing there with Mark, I realized that's what made it worth it. The courage to be yourself, to be seen, and to choose each other every day. That was the real story. And as we paused on the bridge overlooking the quiet river, I knew that whatever twists and turns lay ahead, we'd face them together. Because sometimes, love isn't about having all the answers. It's about finding the person who makes the questions feel less daunting. And that was enough.